Many, many thanks, Mark and Sara and James. Now we have half an hour or so for discussion. Mark and I both participated in a panel discussion last week that was launching the Bond Governance Group. And Paul Collier was also on that panel. And he said, you know, the thing that fragile states need is not budget support, it's life support. He felt that the politics were becoming too dominant in our thinking about fragility and how to engage in fragile states. And there needed to be a return to thinking fundamentally about the economics of fragile states and the need to stimulate growth. I don't think anyone on the panel today would, in a sense, accept that critique. Clearly one needs both. But I'd be very interested to know what you think. How useful is this concept of fragility for shaping the way we think about the role and responsibility of the international community in these kinds of situations? Let's start there. If you have a question, please say who you are. If you have a question that's intended for one individual, please let us know. If you have a comment, please keep it quite short. Okay, I have there you go. Microphone, please.
Thank you. Howard from CARE. My question goes to the sort of how we understand fragility and some of the issues around coming out of the presentations, both from James and Sara. I've been struck by how some years back, when the discourse around fragile states first came out and the discussions in the DAC, there was very much a focus on central state institutions and building capacity of sort of state structures, the sort of state effectiveness or capability side, if you like, in the USAID jargon. And increasingly there's this attention to state legitimacy and issues of sort of state-citizen relations, accountability and so on, which from my experience of working with CARE and with country offices in contexts like Sudan, Afghanistan, Sierra Leone and elsewhere is a welcome development, albeit needing to be tempered by a sort of realism about what's possible and at what stage in these contexts. My question was to the colleague Mark Robinson from DFID to sort of push on that aspect and how that will be incorporated into the white paper. And I've got 3 ideas that we're sort of exploring in CARE together with other peer agencies such as ActionAid. CARE and ActionAid, we're currently doing a study looking from the experience of our country offices and local partners in Uganda, Nepal and Haiti on state building and its implications for our work and the communities that we work with. And 3 of the ideas that have come out of that, one is around how the fragile states principles are applied in different country contexts. So we currently have this DAC ACRA process that's about monitoring the application of the principles in different countries. How do these 2, if you like, models of fragility, whether it's the focus on the central state institutions or this more holistic interpretation, how is that being brought into that process, and how might issues of sort of civil society and accountability or humanitarian perspectives be brought into that or not? And then secondly, around the development of country strategy papers, interestingly at the moment DFID and the Afghanistan unit have published this sort of summary of a new cap for Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is the situation of fragility by definition. I think it would be fascinating to have a sort of engagement by research institutes such as LSE and ODI to sort of participate in the process around that. There is already a dialogue between British government and NGOs on that. Would there be an openness to that, to sort of see how these aspects might be brought in?
Okay, brilliant, thanks. James Darcy in the back there.
Yes, thank you. Is it on? Yes. Thank you, first of all, to all the speakers. I thought it was a really stimulating panel. I've got a comment and a question, if I may. The comment really relates to some things that Sara was saying, and I wanted to echo some of them. I was in Congo recently, DRC, for the World Food Programme, feeding into a conference that was held in Rome last week on working in conflict situations. Very interesting conference. One of the things that struck me there, and has struck me in other contexts, was that an awful lot of what was in the WFP strategy and indeed other people's strategy, seemed to be based on wishful thinking. It seemed to assume things about the context that were demonstrably not true, about the capacity of the government to pick up aspects of service delivery that we knew wasn't going to happen, about even indeed people's own ability to recover in timeframes that were unrealistic. So my feeling is, looking at some of the policy prescriptions, is that they're being unduly constrained by the political desire, understandable, to create a peace dividend, to see political transitions and so on. I think the programs are getting distorted, would be my observation. The question is this, and it's really to James, I think. James, it was very useful, I thought, your helping us think through what constitutes state fragility and so on. Thank you for that. You talk less, and others have as well, about why states are fragile. And in particular, and this relates to what you said too, Mark, why these political settlements are shaky. We had Seth Kaplan here a few weeks ago. His thesis in his book on fragile states, I think, was that it's really the lack of social cohesion that is underlying this lack of effective political settlements. And he constructed that partly around ethnic divisions and so on. Have you anything to say from your research about why are these political settlements so shaky?
Great. I'll take one more comment in this round. Well, two. Guy in the pink shirt and then woman at the front here.
My name's Bruce Mackay from HLSP. We're a consulting firm. I'm worried for DFID. You're going to spend more money in more difficult environments on more difficult, or trying to achieve more difficult things. You want to spend more of it through third-party agencies such as UN agencies and World Bank. So it seems there's a mismatch. I mean, there's a mismatch between an increasingly challenging tasks taking on and your approach to it. And I would ask one particular question is about prioritization. I mean, I work in health. Actually, delivering health care is quite difficult, and I sometimes wonder whether the international community in certain situations wouldn't be better off saying, actually, we're not going to do health. We're not even going to try to do health. We're going to do schools. We might do primary schools. If it's easier, I'm not an education person, but health is so damn difficult that I sometimes think, well, there must be other things that would be, given those situations, that would be more beneficial to their society.
Okay, great. Right down here at the front. You pass the microphone forward. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Heather Marquette from the University of Birmingham. A question really for James and Mark, and then maybe a comment for Sara as well. It was very, very interesting talks, everyone. For James, one of the things that struck me is when you talked about political will, and my colleague Danielle Beswick and I just recently did some applied political analysis in Kenya, and political will is something that came up over and over again. So, for example, with the rule of law, Kenya has a very good functioning commercial legal system and a very poorly functioning criminal system because it suits the powers that be to prioritize one over the other. And it came back not to a lack of capacity, but of political will. So what have you actually done in terms of your research on political will? Mark, you and I have talked about this before in a different context, but one of the things that I find really fascinating about this is that, on the one hand, I'm very attracted by this idea of fragility, but I'm also not convinced that what we're seeing is something that's unique, or that we are living in particularly challenging or difficult times. And I'm just curious as to what you think where the emphasis on fragility is coming from. Is it because the situation in countries is changing and it is becoming more difficult, or is it that because donors and other academics and policymakers and so on are recognizing fragility? And finally, Sara, I thought what you had to say was very interesting. One thing did come up that sort of flagged a concern, which is drawing a dichotomy between elites and civil society. And I think in a lot of countries, civil society are the elites as well. And so perhaps maybe thinking of it in terms of political elites, because they are elites, they went to the same schools, they go to the same functions and so on. And so actually seeing that relationship as being an unproblematic divide is quite tricky.
Okay, very good, thank you. I know there was a comment here, and I'll finish up there and get the panel to react.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be a little bit specific on this one as an example, but I'm very concerned about how we, and when I say we, I mean the international community, believe that we can prevent a country like Pakistan. We've talked about Afghanistan and I think DRC, but Pakistan is currently, according to some people in the country, is a failed state. How do we prevent this? How do we prevent it from going from fragile, if we accept it is, to failed? At the moment, the international community are supporting, in the FATA region and the NWFP, a government policy of clear, hold, build. Now, that's one way of doing things. How do you hold? How do you build? There is a great deal of discussion going on about that as we speak in a meeting today in the NWFP. The problem with budget support and increased aid, I would also like to draw attention to. In terms of the FATA Secretariat itself, in last year, in 2008, they only managed to spend barely 60% of their existing budget. Giving them money is not going to solve this problem. There is a reluctance at all levels, not only at the FATA Secretariat, not only at NWFP, but at national level, for obvious reasons, to incorporate Western concepts into their future ideas on how to prevent the Taliban from increasing their hold in the FATA, NWFP, and even Baluchistan at the moment. How do we deal with that? How does the international community deal with a state that, for its own reasons, cannot be seen openly to be taking your advice? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to ask the panelists maybe to pick one, maximum two of those reflections, and then maybe we'll get another quick chance for another round before we have to close. I know that's always a huge challenge, and they're big issues. But James, are there maybe, let me give you this one.
There's so many things that were raised, and also by Mark and Sara, and you really want me to limit myself to say to two. Okay. I think in the first instance, I have to make one response to Mark, because I think that was very important. There has been a sharp, noticeable neglect, I think, in the policy world, and I think you'd agree with it, given the direction of the white paper, in terms of providing support for economic development in fragile states, the guts of development, productivity raising foreign assistance. So if we see the aid budget to agriculture has gone down from about 12% of all bilateral aid 15 years ago to around 3% today. While there's more attention in policy terms, there's not more attention yet in financial terms. So I mean, I actually would argue, in our coming out of our own research, we would suggest that this has to be a really crucial readjustment. This is true not only for aid to agriculture, but also anything to do with manufacturing, and also, unbelievably in some ways, economic infrastructure. So there really is a redress that has to take place, putting productivity improving assistance and strategies there, and creating within states, this is where the link is not the capacity to think about production, because that's gone, and the states are not, and state officials are not doing it. The TA that's being provided, this was mentioned also, et cetera, often is not being provided in relationship to improving the capacity of states to, in a sense, create the conditions for markets to operate. And this, I would say, is one of the biggest problems in the arena, and so it has to be addressed. And the second area, and I think it touches on a number of contributions, including Sara's, is that I actually think one of the problems of the international community is an overfocus on human rights in some ways in relationship to the necessity of seeing inclusive, and I agree, inclusive elite bargains consolidated. Civil society actually emerges historically and also right now today as a kind of law-bound area that can only be as strong as the states are to protect it. we have these islands of civil society supported by foreign aid or foreign NGOs or something that can't really survive over time. So the more strategic view about this civil society strengthening is actually seeing that synergistic relationship between creating law-bound states where civil societies can have some space to operate over time. And I would love to comment on all the other specific things that were raised, but maybe we can come back.
Mark.
Yes, a rich harvest of really good contributions. Let me pick out two. There was two questions about why are we willing to spend much more of our time and money in this difficult and risky grouping of states. And I think the answer to that is actually quite straightforward in developmental terms. If you look at the states which are performing worst on achieving the MDGs, it's this group of states. It's where poverty is most concentrated in the bottom billion states, to use Collier's language. But also, it's about recognizing the wider externalities generated by war and conflict on not only neighboring states, but actually entire regions. The sheer cost developmentally of conflict is vast. So not to privilege our work in this category of states would be developmental failure. So it's increasingly necessary that we should prioritize this grouping. Linked to that, Heather, your point about why now, why fragility now? And as you recognize, there's a slightly wider set of reasons, I think, shaping that. And I think that is partly related to a larger set of questions which are more geopolitical in nature, and also related to a wider cross-governmental and intergovernmental understanding and concern about the difficulty of addressing large-scale protracted conflict in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. What we need to be careful of is not letting that influence shape the way that we do our developmental engagement elsewhere. It's certainly a factor. Its plus side is that development actually is no longer seen as the exclusive prerogative of an aid agency like ours. It means that we need to increasingly integrate our diplomatic and military perspectives in the most challenging environments into the way we think about how we do development and how we guarantee security. So I think there are positive spin-offs, but as I said, not to be lulled into assuming that's the normal way of doing business for development. A couple of questions about Afghanistan and Pakistan I just want to pick up on. In Afghanistan, the way that we have developed our new country plan has been fundamentally grounded in really good, deep analysis by academic researchers. There's a huge body of analysis, both Afghans and international researchers. And some of that has been, in a sense, quite NGO-like research entities themselves in Kabul. So I would say that's actually a very good example of how we have drawn the best of contemporary analytical work to inform policy choice and direction. The other one was about Pakistan. Many people, I think incorrectly, assume that Pakistan is heading towards state failure. And I say incorrectly because here is a confusion that you often see between fragile or fragility and failure. There's no question. Pakistan in many ways does demonstrate many aspects of what fragile states have, and you've identified a number of those in particular in relation to the FATA region. But you do need to remember with Pakistan there's also enormous resilience, and that resilience has been demonstrated repeatedly. There's been huge numbers of books written about Pakistan, and I think for the most part there is great surprise that Pakistan remains a unified entity. I would argue the emphasis is not, absolutely not, on huge infusions of external aid. Aid remains a pretty smallish share of the government budget, and that's not likely to change very much. So the real challenge in Pakistan is how to help the Pakistan government use its very considerable resources, both financial but also human resources. I mean, what's often forgotten that Pakistan has enormous numbers of extremely well-trained and capable people in the private sector and in government. The problem is that the political structures don't enable them to perform the roles they're entirely capable of providing in terms of ensuring the right environment for investment and private sector growth and ensuring accountable and responsive government. So we're putting a huge effort on state capability in Pakistan, but also on state accountability as the way to think through helping Pakistani institutions function better. You made a really important point. And it goes back to the political settlement. The problems of not including the periphery in the centre of decision-making and having representation at all levels of Pakistan government, it's an ancillary to some of the problems we've seen in Afghanistan. And I think that goes really to the heart of the matter.
Great. Sara, do you have a couple of questions?
Yeah, I'd like to just pick up this issue of civil society. And I think, I would agree that civil society in the capital tends to be dominated by the elite, and that very often is the same elite that represent also the political elite. But if I think about Sudan, and I think about, the women's associations in southern Kordofan, or the pastoralist associations in ABA, or the youth groups in eastern Sudan, these are by no means the elite in any way. And these are very often the groups that we fail to engage with, because all our action tends to be focused in the capital or, the sub-capital, as in the case of Sudan, where, we happen to have two. De facto. And the same applies to our engagement, in processes of state building. They very much focus in the center. And in fact, if we look at lessons from this context, the most effective processes we have witnessed have always been the ones focused on supporting local administrations in the periphery, where the engagement is more genuine, is more focused on immediate needs, on, the specific context, but is much rarer, because we tend not to go out of the capitals. And again, looking at the examples of Sudan, I won't mention names, but it's really frustrating to discuss with some of the donors how very often many of them never get out of the capital, which means never monitor the aid programs they support. And it's the same with many multilateral institutions whose officials are very risk adverse, and that applies to the peacekeeping operation, to UNMISS in Sudan, that is very much entrenched in their compound. Now, if we're not able, to engage with the actors that would be the agents of change, in the peripheries where that, matters all the more, because of course the state very often doesn't reach these areas, then we're really failing to engage with matters to engineer a process of positive change in these countries.
Great, thank you. Well, we have a virtual audience today, and we do have two questions that have come through for our virtual audience. So I'm going to give a bit of space to those, and also take maybe the panel back to two other, I think, really particularly relevant questions that came from the audience that we haven't directly touched on. So in terms of the two questions from our virtual audience, the first is actually from not so virtual. I think he's probably down the hall, which is a bit of a cheat. But I'm sure he's got lots to do, so he's probably watching this as he's working. The role of political parties. If we agree that addressing fragility and building the most appropriate institutional mix is fundamentally a political process, to what extent is there any focus around the development of political systems and the role of political parties in tackling fragility? The other is from someone who's actually with ActionAid in Holland, and asks, often political fragility is linked to various political and economic resource curses. How does the panel think resource curses can be cured, and do they think it is crucial for proceeding from fragility to resilient states? Two, I think, very relevant questions. And the two questions from the audience here that I wanted to come back to related to picking up on James Darcy's point about what do we think causes fragility? I mean, and that links in perhaps nicely with how we think about the issue of natural resource curses. Some of the drivers, we haven't talked very much about the different levels at which fragility can take place and be reinforced. And of course, increasingly, we're looking to the global level to look at drivers of fragility. But I'd be very interested to hear quick views on the panel about what do they think causes fragility. And there's the other question about political will. And I see this as being potentially quite a difficult area. Now, are we talking here ends or means? Is this something that can actually be fundamentally built? Or is this the outcome of other processes that are largely endogenously driven, actually, and which political will there comes out as the prize at the end of the day? The panel, Mark, would you like to touch on any of those?
To our two anonymous contributors, I'm glad that the first flags the importance of political parties. I think for too long, actually both academia and policymakers have ignored this critically important phenomenon, and instead perhaps rather given too much relative emphasis to civil society. Both have a critical role. Now, parties certainly are important in terms of, as we know, the aggregation of large numbers of interest. They help to shape policy alternatives. They shape values in society. They also fundamentally are different insofar as they seek to provide a vehicle for the control of political power in the executive through elections. So parties should not be ignored. They will be at our peril. It doesn't necessarily therefore mean we should start funding political parties with lots of money. It does mean that we need to be thinking much more about taking into account what are the incentives that drives politicians to make particular kinds of policy choices and to form particular kinds of political alliances. So we need to be much more sensitive to those factors, both understanding political drive and incentives and the aggregation of interest through parties. I agree with the critique of political will. And I think really it's about the construction of a set of common interests around a vision and an agenda by politicians to drive through a sustained development series of priorities that is important here. There are examples that we have of where that's been achieved, sometimes through the vehicle of a political party, often through the determined view of a series of reformers who've come to power and want a fundamental change in the system. So political leadership is really important. Resource curse. There's some really interesting work around creation of a resource charter at the moment. There's the work we need to build on in terms of the EITI, how we can learn lessons from some northern experience in terms of the management of windfall funds, particularly important given the volatility of revenues through commodities on international markets at the moment. So I think that managing resources effectively to prevent the future curse is a challenge, and I don't think it's an inevitability. I'll let others talk about the third issue.
Sara.
Yeah, well, I've been involved in this European Development Report, which is looking at, sort of policy responses to fragile states. And there's been, extensive analysis of what the drivers of fragility are. And I guess after 4 or 5 rounds, I've come to the conclusions they are so numerous and so different that, we can spend, another half an hour listing all of them. But what is important to bear in mind is that each specific context has very specific drivers of fragility. And that's why, go back to what I was saying before, we need that sophisticated analysis to understand what are the issues at play, how they interact, and what are, the entry points to start, unwinding some of these perverse processes. But, it is not very helpful to generalize and put them all in the same basket. One comment also on the resource curse. Some of the work on the resource charter and, discussions around the EITI and things like that were also discussed in one of the rounds of the EDR. And what struck me is that once again, we are focusing on models and policy frameworks that very much speak to an external audience. These are things, to which we may relate, but actually don't really speak to the actors in these countries, are not as relevant. And I think, there is, at least at present, not enough focus on looking at which institutions in country can be supported and can be helped to engage, with state actors to make sure that, access to resources is better regulated. It's all the area of custody institutions and how to support the pluralism around, legal frameworks, which is missing from the policy frameworks we're developing at the moment around resources and need more attention.
Great. Thank you very much, Sara. James, you were still scribbling.
Yeah. I'm just trying to decide the most important things to say. These are very good questions coming from both afar and close up in the audience. I think in our own research, we would say that the role of political parties as such is decisive. And in fact, if you want to understand what happened in Tanzania or in Zambia, the role of the ruling political party was crucial to creating the kind of an inclusive bargains and making them last over time, to institutionalize them. And often in Tanzania, what the poor peasant saw was TANU or the CCM rather than the state, or the state manifested as that party. That those parties were inclusive was much more important than the, competitive electoral processes. For many years, in integrating, providing some kind of pattern of national integration in Tanzania. Only after that period could Tanzania perhaps withstand the kind of destabilizing effects that competitive elections can have. So the political party is very crucial. One only has to look at the divergence between a country like Tanzania or Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there was some effort by Mobutu to just declare a party. And in Tanzania, there were 45 years of party building that went on before independence, as it were, and not a day, really, or maybe a day in the DRC. And this is extremely important to understand. So I do think political parties have not had enough attention. I think, in fact, that still in academic terms, the key work is Duverger's book, dates from the 1960s, and that says something about the need to do a lot more serious work on political parties. Our own research really puts into question how determinant the resource curse is. Now, obviously, patterns of elite satisficing and whatnot are exacerbated by the access to resources, and incentives for building taxation and revenue capacities are often lessened in resource-rich countries. But we have as many examples of developmental use of resources as we do of resource curse. Just look also historically, Sweden's capitalism emerged first out of having a monopoly sort of in copper and in timber, and those rich resources that formed the basis of what would come later. And if we look at Botswana today or other examples, there's many counter-examples. And so what becomes important is what kind of bargain is struck in resource-rich countries that would allow the diversion of the wealth gained from resources into more developmental activity. James's point about what causes fragility, I think it comes back to this question of political parties, in a sense. The lack of political organization on the one hand and the persistence of institutional multiplicity. I agree with Mark that, important part of state building is the rule of law. This is what I meant in a way by state institutions coming to trump rival ones, it being crucial to the process of assuring some kind of resilience over time and eventually development. But I would put it down to those two really important issues. Of course, that begs the question, why are some places able to have political organization, others not? There we find historical roots in colonial period. And what are the incentives that exist? What are the threats that face the elites becomes very important, that they will overcome collective action problems to put up political organizations, to develop rule systems or institutions that actually, to some extent, curb their behavior. Generally, in successful situations, elites have gone along with more state building, constructive state building, when they have been faced with a combination of coercion and positive incentives for making profits. So I think we need to look at those aspects. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you very, very much. Sorry to rush you towards the end. Well, in a sense, I think this discussion today has both been incredibly informative, but it's also opened up a whole agenda. And I think that's exactly where we wanted to be at the end of this session, because we're certainly hoping to take many aspects of the discussion today forward in a series of meetings that we will hold from September onwards, that will look at some of the elements of the discussion today about the role of the elites, the role of political settlements, the experience around building political settlements that have traction, the political settlement as rules of the game, in a sense, that govern state functioning and the relationship with society. The question about this notion of humanitarian development space, what does this mean in operational terms? What does it look like? What does it mean we do differently? About the economics of resilience, of building towards resilience and dynamic development, about the importance of promoting and creating an enabling environment for growth and development. We're going to be looking at each of those issues in a series of meetings from September, so we'd be delighted to welcome you back. Thank you very much for your participation today, and thank you very much to the panel for a very stimulating discussion. Thank you. Thank you.